The sun clawed at the earth, its heat a relentless fist grinding the desert into dust. Elias Oner's boots crunched against the cracked ground, each step kicking up a faint haze that stung his eyes. His shadow stretched long and lean behind him, a ghost that refused to leave. The ranch was miles off, its silhouette lost in the shimmering horizon. He'd been walking since dawn, searching for the stray calf he'd heard bawling in the night. His canteen hung heavy at his hip, half empty, the water inside warm as blood. The air smelled of scorched sage and something sharper, decay, faint but unmistakable. He stopped, squinting against the glare, and saw it, a shape slumped against a jagged outcrop of rock, motionless, human. Her hair was black as a raven's wing, matted with dirt and blood, spilling over a face too pale for the living. Her body was curled tight, knees drawn to her chest, as if she'd tried to fold herself into nothing. Elias knelt, his knees grinding into the grit. Her breath was shallow, a faint rasp against the wind's low moan. An Apache girl, young, maybe 16, her buckskin dress torn at the shoulder, stained dark. A gash ran along her arm, crusted but still weeping. He touched her wrist, cool, but not cold. Alive, barely. The desert didn't care. It never did. He lifted her, her weight slight as a child's, though her limbs hung heavy with surrender. Her head lolled against his chest, and he felt the faint heat of her breath through his shirt. The ranch was too far to carry her, but there was no leaving her here. Not with the buzzards already circling, their shadows slicing across the sand. He shifted her in his arms, her hair brushing his calloused fingers, and started walking. The sun pressed harder, a weight on his shoulders as real as her body. His own heart thudded, steady but loud, reminding him he was still here, still moving. The cabin came into view as the sky bruised purple, the day bleeding out. It was a low, weathered thing, its timbers warped by years of heat and wind. He kicked the door open, the hinges groaning, and laid her on the cot inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and leather. He lit a kerosene lamp, its flicker casting jagged shadows on the walls. Her face was sharper now in the light, high cheekbones, a mouth pinched with pain. He poured water from his canteen into a tin cup, held it to her lips. Most of it spilled, but her throat moved, a faint swallow. Enough. He sat back on his heels, watching her chest rise and fall, each breath a small defiance. His hands shook, not from the weight of her but from something older, heavier. The last time he'd carried someone like this, it was his sister, her body broken after the wagon accident. He'd been too late then, the memory a stone in his chest. He pushed it down, focusing on the girl's shallow breaths, the way her fingers twitched like she was reaching for something lost. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. He stood, his knees creaking, and stepped onto the porch. The desert stretched endless, a sea of shadow under a sky pricked with stars. He'd come here to escape, creditors, memories, the weight of a life that kept breaking. The ranch was supposed to be his salvation, but it was just another kind of loneliness, vast and unyielding. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward like a prayer he didn't believe in. Somewhere out there, he thought he heard hooves. Distant, but growing closer. Or maybe it was just the wind, playing tricks. He went back inside, checking her again. Her eyes were still closed, but her breathing was steadier now, her face less like death. He draped a blanket over her, its edges frayed from years of use. His fingers lingered on the wool, remembering his mother's hands weaving it long ago. The girl stirred, a faint moan escaping her lips, and he froze, waiting. She didn't wake. He sat in the chair by the cot, the lamp burning low, and watched her through the night. The desert outside was silent now, but it felt like it was holding its breath. Dawn broke slow, a thin line of gold slicing through the horizon like a blade. Elias hadn't slept, his eyes gritty as the sand outside. The girl's breathing had steadied through the night, each inhale a quiet victory against the desert's indifference. He rose from the chair, his joints stiff, and boiled water over the small iron stove. The cabin smelled of damp wood and the faint tang of blood from her wound. He tore a strip from an old shirt, soaked it, and cleaned the gash on her arm. Her skin was warm now, feverish, but she didn't stir. Her face, even in pain, held a kind of stillness that made him look away, like he was trespassing. He stepped outside, the air sharp with morning chill. The desert was vast and silent, its edges softened by the pale light. He remembered another morning, years back, standing on his father's porch in Missouri. The fields had been green then, alive with the hum of cicadas. He'd been 20, full of plans, until the bank took the land and his sister's accident took the rest of his hope. He'd carried her body home that day, her weight heavier than anything he'd ever borne. The memory clawed at him now, sharp as the girl's wound, and he pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. He needed to find food, something to keep her alive. He checked the traps near the creek bed, a half-mile off. The water was low, a sluggish trickle over smooth stones. One trap held a thin jackrabbit, its eyes wide and unseeing. He skinned it quick, the knife steady in his hands, though his mind wandered to the girl's face, her fingers twitching in her sleep. Back at the cabin, he roasted the meat over the fire, the smell filling the small space. She stirred as he worked, her eyelids fluttering but not opening. He set a tin plate beside her, the meat cooling, and sat back, watching. Her eyes opened at midday, dark and sharp, like a deer catching a scent. She didn't move, just stared at him, her gaze a weight he could feel. He held up the tin cup, offering water. She took it, her hands trembling, and drank in small, careful sips. No words passed between them. Her silence wasn't fear, he thought, but something deeper, grief, maybe, or distrust worn into her bones. He pointed to the meat, and she ate slowly, her movements deliberate, like she was measuring each bite against her strength. He wanted to ask her name, where she'd come from, what had left her dying in the desert. But the questions felt like stones in his mouth, too heavy to speak. Instead, he busied himself with the fire, adding a stick, watching the flames lick upward. The cabin felt smaller with her awake, her presence a quiet force, like a storm gathering far off. He thought of his mother, how she'd sit by the hearth back home, humming hymns to fill the silence. He hadn't heard music in years. The memory stung, and he stood, stepping outside to escape it. The desert was still, but the air carried a faint rumble now, hooves, unmistakable this time. He squinted toward the horizon, where dust rose in a thin cloud. Riders, too many to count, their shapes blurred by distance. His hand went to the rifle leaning against the porch rail, its wood warm from the sun. He didn't know who they were, Apache, outlaws, or something else, but the girl's presence in his cabin felt like a spark in dry grass. He glanced back through the open door, where she sat on the cot, her eyes fixed on him, unreadable. He stepped inside, grabbing his coat. "Stay here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She didn't respond, but her gaze followed him as he moved to the door, rifle in hand. The riders were closer now, their shadows stretching long across the sand. 50, maybe more, their horses kicking up dust that burned gold in the afternoon light. Elias's heart thudded, not with fear but with something older, resignation, maybe, or the weight of choices he hadn't yet made. Elias stood on the porch, the rifle heavy in his hands, its barrel catching the sun's dying light. The riders were close enough now to see their shapes, Apache, by their dress, their horses lean and fast, kicking up clouds of dust that glowed like embers. His grip tightened, knuckles whitening, but his face stayed still, carved from years of holding back. The girl's presence in the cabin behind him was a pulse in his mind, steady and insistent. He didn't know why they were coming, but he felt the weight of her life in his hands, fragile as the flame he'd kept burning through the night. He stepped back inside, shutting the door with a soft thud. She was sitting up now, her back against the wall, eyes wide and searching. Her fingers clutched the blanket, the frayed edges twisted tight. He wanted to say something, reassurance, maybe, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he pointed to the corner, where a loose floorboard hid a small crawl space. "There," he said, his voice low. She nodded, understanding, and moved with a quiet grace despite her weakness. She slipped into the shadows beneath the boards, her eyes meeting his for a moment, dark, unreadable, but not afraid. The hoofbeats grew louder, a rhythm that shook the earth. Elias propped the rifle against the wall, within reach, and sat at the table, his hands resting on the rough wood. He lit another cigarette, the smoke curling slow, a thin veil between him and the world outside. The riders stopped just beyond the porch, their horses snorting, the air thick with the smell of sweat and dust. A voice called out, sharp and guttural, in a language he didn't know but felt in his bones. He didn't move, didn't answer. Let them come to him. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered like the cliffs beyond the ranch. His eyes were sharp, scanning the room, lingering on the cot where the blanket still held the shape of her body. Elias exhaled smoke, slow and deliberate, meeting the man's gaze. "You lost something?" he asked, his voice steady, though his heart thudded like a drum. The man didn't answer, just stepped further in, followed by two others. Their hands rested on knives at their belts, but they didn't draw. Elias gestured to the tin cup on the table, still half full of water. "Help yourself," he said, nodding toward it. The leader's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. The silence stretched, heavy as the heat outside, until the man spoke, his English clipped and careful. "A girl. She was seen. Near here." Elias took another drag, the cigarette's glow a small defiance. "Seen a lot of things out here," he said. "Coyotes. Buzzards. Nothing worth chasing." The lie was smooth, but his pulse betrayed him, hammering in his throat. The leader stepped closer, his shadow falling across the table, and Elias felt the air shift, like the moment before a storm breaks. He thought of the girl, hidden beneath the floor, her breath shallow, her life hanging on his next words. He remembered a night years ago, hiding with his sister in the barn as creditors came for their father's land. They'd crouched in the hay, her small hand in his, both of them silent as the men shouted outside. He'd promised to protect her then, and failed. The memory burned, but it steadied him now. He leaned back in the chair, meeting the leader's eyes. "You're welcome to look," he said, gesturing to the empty cot. "Ain't much here." The leader's gaze lingered, then flicked to the others. They moved through the cabin, quick and thorough, checking corners, lifting the blanket. Elias watched, his face a mask, though his fingers itched for the rifle. They didn't find the crawl space. The leader turned back, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw something like respect, or maybe pity, in his eyes. "We'll be back," the man said, then turned and left, the others following. The hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the desert's vast silence. Elias waited until the dust settled, then knelt by the floorboard, lifting it. She was there, curled tight, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "They're gone," he whispered. She climbed out, slow and careful, and sat on the cot again, her hands folded in her lap. The cabin felt heavier now, the air thick with what hadn't been said. The girl sat on the cot, her hands still, her eyes fixed on the floor. Elias leaned against the wall, the rifle now back in its corner, its presence a quiet reminder of the world outside. The cabin was silent, save for the faint creak of the timbers settling in the evening cool. He wanted to speak, to ask who she was, why they hunted her, but her stillness held him back. It wasn't fear in her posture, but a kind of waiting, like a deer poised to bolt. He poured more water into the tin cup and set it beside her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and drank without looking up. He stepped outside to check the horizon. The dust from the riders had long settled, the desert stretching empty under a sky heavy with stars. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of sage and something fainter, blood, maybe, or his own sweat. He thought of his father, standing on their old porch, staring at fields he'd never own again. "You can't outrun what's coming," he'd said, the night before he left for good. Elias had been 16, too young to understand, too old to forget. Now, with the girl inside and the rider's threat lingering like smoke, he felt that truth settle into his bones. Back inside, she was eating again, small bites of the rabbit meat, her movements slow but steady. The lamp's light softened her face, the sharp edges of pain dulled by rest. He sat across from her, his hands folded, searching for words. "They'll come back," he said finally, his voice low, not wanting to break the fragile quiet. Her eyes met his, dark and deep, and for the first time, she spoke. "I know," she said, her voice soft but clear, accented, like the wind over the rocks. "They always do." Her name was Nai, she told him, the word falling like a stone into still water. She didn't say more, and he didn't press. The name felt enough, a small gift in the silence. He thought of his sister again, how she'd whispered her secrets to him in the dark, promises of a future they'd never have. The memory tightened his chest, and he stood, busying himself with the fire to shake it off. The flames crackled, spitting sparks, and he felt her watching him, her gaze a weight he couldn't name. He showed her the creek the next morning, the water glinting like glass under the rising sun. She washed her face, her hands moving with a quiet reverence, as if the water was more than just water. He watched from a distance, his boots sinking into the soft earth, and wondered what she'd lost to end up here, half dead in his desert. The rider's shadows lingered in his mind, their purpose unclear but heavy with intent. He'd heard stories of Apache bands clashing with settlers, of stolen kin, of vengeance that burned like wildfire. Nai didn't seem like a thief or a fugitive, but then, he'd learned long ago that looks meant nothing in a world this hard. They spent the day in small tasks, mending a fence, checking traps, her following him like a shadow. She moved slow, her strength returning in fits and starts, but she didn't complain. When he handed her a hammer to fix a loose post, her fingers closed around it with a certainty that surprised him. They worked in silence, the desert's vastness swallowing the sound of their labor. By dusk, the air was thick with the smell of rain, clouds gathering like a bruise on the horizon. He felt the shift in her, too, a wariness, like she was measuring the distance to the next escape. That night, she sat by the fire, her knees drawn up, staring into the flames. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. He looked at her, the question hanging between them. "Why help me?" she pressed, her eyes searching his face. He didn't answer right away, the words caught in the tangle of his own guilt, his failures. "Didn't have a choice," he said finally, though it wasn't the whole truth. She nodded, as if she understood the weight of things unsaid, and turned back to the fire. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft against the roof, a sound like forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. The rain fell harder now, a steady drum against the cabin's roof, turning the desert outside into a sea of mud. Elias sat by the fire, its warmth a small defiance against the damp chill creeping through the walls. Nai hadn't moved from her spot on the cot, her knees still drawn up, her eyes tracing patterns in the flames. The silence between them was heavy, not empty, filled with the weight of her question and his half-truth. He wanted to tell her about his sister, about the guilt that clung to him like dust, but the words felt like betraying a grave. Instead, he watched her, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek, the faint scar above her brow. He thought of the riders, their shadows still lingering in his mind. They'd come for her, that much was clear, but why? A runaway, a thief, a daughter they'd lost, he could guess, but none of it fit the quiet strength in her hands, the way she'd gripped the hammer earlier, like she'd built a life before it broke. He remembered a winter night, his mother telling him stories of the frontier, of people who carried their homes in their hearts because the world took everything else. I felt like that, a person unmoored, yet rooted in something he couldn't see. You don't have to stay, he said, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, like gravel underfoot. If you've got somewhere to go. Her eyes flicked to him, sharp and steady, and for a moment, he thought she'd speak. Instead, she shook her head, a small gesture, almost lost in the fire's glow. Nowhere, she said, the word soft but final, like a door closing. He nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. The desert had a way of stripping people down to their bones, leaving them with nothing but the truth of themselves. He stood, crossing to the window. The rain blurred the world outside, but he felt the rider's presence, a shadow just beyond the storm. He thought of running, taking her and disappearing into the night, but the desert was no place for hiding. It saw everything, judged nothing. He turned back to her, his hands restless at his sides. If they come again, he said, I need to know what they want. She looked at him, her face unreadable, then nodded once, slow, like she was weighing the cost of trust. She spoke then, her voice low, weaving through the rain's rhythm. My brother, she said. He fought them. Killed one of their own. They took me to punish him. Her words were sparse, but they carried the weight of a life torn apart. He saw it in her eyes, the loss she didn't name, the kind that hollowed you out. He wanted to ask more, where her brother was, if he was still alive, but her silence told him enough. She was alone, like him, carrying ghosts she couldn't bury. He sat again, closer now, the fire's heat warming his hands. I lost someone, too, he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. My sister. Accident. I couldn't save her. His voice cracked, just a little, and he hated it, the rawness of it. I looked at him, her gaze softer now, not pity but something else, recognition, maybe. She reached out, her hand resting on his for a moment, her fingers cool and steady. It was the first touch he'd felt in years that didn't carry pain. The rain slowed, a faint patter now, and the air felt lighter, like the world was exhaling. He wanted to believe they could stay like this, two broken things finding shelter, but the desert didn't make promises. He thought of the riders, their knives glinting in the sun, and knew they'd return. Nai's hand slipped away, and she curled back into herself, her eyes on the fire again. He stood, checking the rifle, its weight a comfort and a curse. The choice was coming, he felt it. Run or fight, hide or stand. He looked at her, her silhouette sharp against the flames, and knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. The morning broke clear, the rain's memory lingering only in the damp earth and the faint glint of puddles scattered across the desert. Elias stood outside, his breath visible in the cool air, his eyes scanning the horizon. The rifle leaned against the porch rail, its barrel cold now, but ready. Nai was inside, her presence a quiet anchor in the cabin's stillness. He'd woken to find her already up, folding the blanket with careful hands, her movements deliberate, like she was preparing for something inevitable. The weight of her story, her brother, the riders, the blood debt, sat heavy in his chest, mingling with his own ghosts. He walked the perimeter of the ranch, checking the fences, his boots sinking into the soft ground. The desert was alive today, the air sharp with the scent of wet sage and the distant call of a hawk. He thought of his sister's laugh, how it used to cut through the heavy Missouri summers, bright and fleeting. He hadn't saved her, hadn't been enough, and the failure had driven him here, to a place where the land itself seemed to punish hope. But Nai, with her steady eyes and quiet strength, made him wonder if redemption wasn't a place, but a choice. Back inside, she was sitting at the table, a piece of cornbread in her hands, crumbling it more than eating. Her wound was healing, the gash on her arm less angry now, though her face still carried the shadow of pain. They'll come today, she said, her voice low, certain. He nodded, not questioning her. The desert had its own rhythm, and she seemed to hear it better than he did. He checked the rifle again, counting the bullets in his pocket, 6. Enough for a stand, not a war. He looked at her, searching for fear, but found only resolve, like she'd already made her peace. He wanted to ask her to run, to take her somewhere the riders couldn't find. But her eyes told him she wouldn't go, not yet. "You don't owe me," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "You've done enough." Her words stung, not for their meaning but for the truth they carried. He wasn't doing this for her alone, but for himself, for the chance to be more than the man who failed his sister. He shook his head, unable to answer, and stepped outside to wait. The riders came at midday, their horses a dark wave against the sun-bleached sand. 50, as before, their shapes sharp now, no longer blurred by distance. Elias stood on the porch, rifle in hand, his heart steady but loud. Naai stepped out beside him, her chin high, her hands empty but clenched. The leader dismounted, his boots heavy in the dirt, his eyes locking on her. "Naai," he said, her name a blade in his mouth. She didn't flinch, but Elias felt her tense, a wire pulled taut. "You've kept her," the leader said, his gaze shifting to Elias. "That was a mistake." Elias didn't move, the rifle a weight he wasn't ready to lift. "She's no one's to keep," he said, his voice calm, though his pulse roared. The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the desert held its breath. Then Naai stepped forward, her voice clear, cutting through the silence. "Take me," she said. "Let him be." Elias's grip tightened, his eyes on her, but she didn't look back. The leader studied her, then him, and something shifted, a flicker of doubt, maybe, or respect. "No blood today," the leader said finally, his voice grudging. "But we take her." Elias stepped forward, the rifle rising, but Naai's hand on his arm stopped him, her touch firm, final. "Don't," she whispered. "This is mine." She walked toward the riders, her step steady, her shadow trailing long behind her. Elias watched, his throat tight, the rifle useless in his hands. The leader mounted, pulling her up behind him, and the riders turned, their hoofbeats fading into the desert's vastness. The sun climbed higher, its heat a curse again, baking the ground until it cracked. Elias stood alone, the cabin silent behind him, the air thick with dust and loss. He thought of her eyes, her hand on his, and felt the weight of a choice made, not his, but hers. The desert stretched on, indifferent, and he walked back inside, the door closing soft as a sigh. The cabin was too quiet now, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls, heavy with absence. Elias sat at the table, the tin cup still there, its rim stained with her touch. The fire had gone to embers, a faint glow casting long shadows across the floor. He hadn't moved since she left, his hands resting on the wood, fingers tracing the grain as if it held answers. The desert outside was still, the sun long gone, its heat replaced by a cold that seeped into his bones. He thought of Naai's eyes, the way they'd held his for a moment before she walked away, steady and sure, carrying her own weight. He stood, slow, his joints protesting, and stepped onto the porch. The night was vast, stars sharp as knives against the black. The desert stretched endless, its edges lost in shadow, but it didn't feel empty anymore. Her presence lingered, not in the cabin but in him, a quiet shift he couldn't name. He remembered the day he'd buried his sister, the dirt under his nails, the way the earth had swallowed her without a sound. He'd run from that, from the guilt, the failure, thinking the desert could burn it away. But Naai had shown him something else, not redemption, but the possibility of carrying pain without breaking. He walked to the creek, the ground crunching under his boots, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. The water was low, a faint trickle reflecting the moonlight, and he knelt, dipping his hands into its cold bite. He thought of her washing her face here, her hands moving with reverence, as if the water was a prayer. He'd wanted to save her, to rewrite his own story through hers, but she'd chosen her own path, her own fight. Her courage was a mirror, showing him the man he might still become, not whole, but enough. The horizon was empty, no dust, no hoofbeats, just the vast quiet of a world that didn't care. He thought of the riders, of Nai's brother, of the blood that bound them all in a knot he'd never untangle. He didn't know if she'd live, if she'd find peace, but he hoped she'd carry something of this place, a moment of shelter, a touch that didn't ask for anything in return. He stood, his hands dripping, the water falling back to the creek, each drop a small ripple, gone in an instant. Back inside, he lit the lamp, its flicker steady against the dark. The cot was empty, the blanket folded neat, as she'd left it. He sat, the chair creaking under his weight, and looked at the fire's embers, their glow faint but stubborn. He thought of his mother's hymns, his sister's laugh, Nai's hand on his, and felt something loosen in his chest, not forgiveness, but a kind of acceptance, like the desert itself, taking everything and giving nothing back but space to keep going. He'd stay, he knew that now. The ranch wasn't salvation, but it was his, a place to stand, to face whatever came next. The riders might return, or they might not. The desert didn't promise answers, only time. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and listened to the silence, softer now, like the sound of his own breath, steady and unbroken. The night stretched on, and the desert held him, its vastness a cradle, its indifference a kind of grace. The sun would rise again, baking the ground until it cracked, but for now, he was here, alive, and that was enough.